delighted because you know that he's insightful, truthful, and he follows the Rotary four-way test.
So my joke was I was going to say that I was going to call like Kathy and say I have to cancel today because there's absolutely nothing to talk about. I can't come up with anything. But what I want to do today is get you to think a little bit about how political scientists think about campaigns and elections, and with that, give you some thoughts in terms of the 2024 election. Because I know most of the time during a presidential election year, no matter what I talk about, the only thing people really want to know when I talk is the question is, well, who's going to win or something like that. And so I'm going to try to talk you through how I think political scientists and how I think about the election in terms of giving you some kind of ideas about what's going to happen this year. Now, with my students at Hamlin, I sometimes say to them that political science is an exceedingly easy discipline. It really only comes down to three different words: describe, explain, and predict. And what I mean by that is to say that our first job as a political scientist is just simply to describe something, what happened, who ran, who won, et cetera, like that. Just very, very descriptive. And in some sense, but not completely, that's a little bit parallel to what journalists do, because they're doing a lot of description, who did what, et cetera. But also like journalists, but I think a little bit different, we then get into the explain. Who won and why? Who ran and why? What happened? Why? Part. But then, because we like to think we're scientists at some point, we get into the prediction. We try to figure out why, what's going to happen, or something like that. And that's what I'm going to try to talk a little bit about today in terms of predictions. Now, I'm going to leave a lot of room for discussion today here too, because I know there's a lot of things I could talk about, and there's a lot of things you probably want to ask me about. So I'm going to lay out a talk and lay out an argument here. And what I want to start with is, again, how political scientists, let's say, think about elections. And I'm going to take us back to 2 years ago, 2022. And I could probably have also used 2020 during the presidential election as a way of thinking about it. And as part of what political scientists like to do is to try to figure out what are the factors that drive elections? What are the factors that really do influence elections at the end of the day? And generally, political scientists and some of the better political science models that are out there, I say better, I didn't say they were necessarily good, but better models that are out there, will say that what we need to do is to look at the second quarter of an election year. Roughly we're looking at, the April, May, and June. And what seems to be correlated reasonably well in the second quarter of an election year are a few different things. One of them is if we look at presidential approval ratings. Generally, in the second quarter of election year, the higher a presidential approval rating, generally it means it's going to be good for the president running for re-election or for the president's party in terms of running for election. A second factor is usually things along the lines of public perceptions of how the economy is doing. And there's probably some other variations out there in terms of it where some people might look at things such as, for example, inflation rates and a couple things. But if you think about it here, the big focus of most of the models are about approval ratings and some type of economic variable or perception of the economy. And the reason why I mention that, if we take us back 2 years ago to approximately a point, let us say about March or April of 2022, we were looking at Joe Biden with a presidential approval rating of about 40%. It was about in the same place where Donald Trump's approval rating was at his midterm. At the same time, some of you might remember that we were looking at accelerating gas prices at this point because of the economy, inflation. Many of us were going to the grocery store, buying, spending $100 and saying, my God, it only buys this amount of groceries or something like that. And the point being is that we saw that public was viewing the economy or inflation as a problem. Every time they went to the gas station, every time they went to the grocery store, Joe Biden was having low approval ratings. And the reason why I mention this is that a very standard model for how to think about the presidential election, or in this case, the midterm election, would be to say the president's party is going to have a really bad time in the 2022 midterm elections. In general, in midterm elections, the president's party, on average, loses about 26 seats in the House, on average about 6 to 7 seats in the Senate. Given how close the House and Senate was divided, everybody back then, both in the media and the political scientists, were saying that the Democrats are going to get routed. It's going to be a horrible midterm election, and it's going to be similar to what happened when Donald Trump was at the midterm, and he basically lost, control of a part of the legislature. Or back in 2010, when Barack Obama, after his first 2 years, his party also did very badly. So we have a pretty good model that's out there. However, as I always say, if political scientists were fully accurate, if our models were really predictive, I don't even know why we hold elections. There'd be no point in holding them. Why not just actually do the predictions in March, April, or May, run the numbers, declare who it's going to be, and it could save us all the effort of all the campaign spending, all the commercials, everything, et cetera, et cetera. Except this is the part where I no longer consider myself to be, let us say, a great political scientist, because in some ways I say, I do think campaigns and elections matter. I do think at the end of the day, things like strategy, candidates, having a message, having a theme really does matter. But if we were to go back, again, 2 years ago, second quarter, it was not looking good for the Democrats. All the numbers were suggesting that the Republicans were going to take the House and the Senate, and it was going to be basically a stalemate for the next 2 years in Congress. And that seemed to be where we were supposed to be up until about the end of June of 2022. And at the end of 2022, something happened dramatic. And that was the U.S. Supreme Court issued the Dobbs opinion that basically said that the right to terminate a pregnancy was not protected in the Constitution. And what became really fascinating is for several months how this shifted the dynamics of the campaign. Now, this gets me to another theme that I want to talk about today in the process. I'm going to weave about 2 or 3 themes together here today. If one of the most frequent questions I get is predicting the election, the 2 other most frequent questions that I get is people will wring their hands and say, isn't this the most politically polarized era we ever lived in? And of course, I always come back and say, Civil War still beats this. But the second one is people will say, the polls were all wrong. How can we trust polls? Well, if we go back to the polls in April, Republicans are going to win a big time. We're going to win big. By the time we get to July and August, the polls are starting to shift because the voters, a critical constituency of the voters, is now saying that reproductive rights are a big issue. And the voters that truly mattered are college-educated suburban women. I have argued this for at least 20 years, and all the data pans that out, is that what college-educated suburban women do really determines elections in America. Women are the majority of the electorate in the United States. Now they're about 51%, and there's an enormous gender gap in terms of voting. What I mean by gender gap, men voting Republican, women's likely to vote Democrat. But women, college-educated women, are also an interesting group. Interesting in the sense that they haven't completely bought into being solid Democrats, but they're certainly not Republicans in the way they were 25 or 30 or 35 years ago. They're a little bit more, if I can use the phrase, swingy, in the sense of, is that if they show up and vote, they're likely to vote Democrat. If they're not enthusiastic, if they don't show up in large numbers to vote, Republicans benefit. Example, in 2016, college-educated suburban women were not quite as enthusiastic about Hillary Clinton as they should have been, or some people thought, Clinton thought they should have been, I should say, and that really helped Donald Trump in terms of the election. But the reason why I bring this into our discussion here is that yet another theme that I'm interested in, and you're going to see how it all comes together in a few minutes here, folks, is that one of the things that I've really become interested in the last, actually it's now about 10 years, goes back to a conversation I had in the waiting room or the green room for Almanac. and it was with Stacy Hunter Hecht, who used to teach at Bethel. Some of you might remember her. And Stacy was just a really delightful person. And 2 years before the presidential election, she turned to me, we were having a conversation, and she said, you know, of course, David, that the presidential election is over in 40 states. And I said, yeah, it is. And we knew it was already over 2 years before the 2016 election because of the fact that we're so polarized. 90% plus Democrats vote Democrat, 90% Republicans vote Republican. And because of the spatial distribution, some states have more Republicans than Democrats and vice versa. We could tell 2 years in advance how Texas, California, Massachusetts, all those states were going to go. We knew the election came down to only 10 states that were going to determine the election. And originally, we wrote a book that the whole premise was basically called 10-10-270. Those swing states were evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. Only about 10% of the voters truly mattered. 10% of the voters in 10 states determined who would become the president. Basically, remember, to win the presidency, you have to win the Electoral College. It's not winning the popular vote, it's winning the electoral votes across 50 elections across the country. So we said it's 10-10-270. Additionally, we know, and we knew this in 2022, that the number of seats in Congress that's truly in play is less than 30. We're looking at an incredibly small number of seats that are in play out of 425. So we're down to, what? A few swing voters in a few swing states determine who wins the presidency. At the congressional level, we're down to a few swing voters and a few swing congressional seats that determine who controls Congress. And for both the congressional and for the presidency, it is what? Mostly college-educated suburban women who really drive the election. What they do determines everything. The reason why this is all important, I'll bring us back in a couple of different ways here, is that if we look at 2022, and I'll get to the presidentials again in a few minutes here. If we get to 2022, it wasn't a presidential election year. Remember, it was just Congress. We had probably no more than 30 congressional seats that were in play, probably no more than about 7 congressional seats. U.S. Senate seats that were in play. If you looked at the polls for the Senate seats, by sometime in late July, early August, in those 7 competitive seats, the Democrats had taken the lead. They were now ahead. But since I'm one of these people who teaches polling, the first thing that I do when I look at polls, I never look at the numbers. I look at the methodology. I look at things like the margins of error. And the polls were saying the Democrats were ahead with a plus or minus of about 3 to 4 points in the polls, and most of the leads were about 1 or 2 points. Who's really in the lead? Really hard to tell at this point. These are horse races. But something had shifted. And through August into early September, now the story was that reproductive rights, the main issue driving college-educated suburban women, was now tipping the hand over to the Democrats. But then, in late September and in October, it looked like the abortion issue was starting to run its course. We started to see at this point people still concerned about inflation. People are still going to the local gas station, paying a lot of money for gas every time they go, paying a lot of money at the grocery store. And we started to see again the polls now to shift. And in a lot of those critical Senate races, the polls were now suggesting that the Republicans had regained the lead. And the media, especially the national media, is saying the Republicans are going to hold the Senate. Now, no one's doing polling at the congressional level because those polls would be god-awful expensive to do, just in terms of isolating those populations and really zeroing in on them. And so the story was now that it was the Democrats that were going to lose. But remember, these are polls that are still what? Races that are 1 or 2 points, plus or minus is 3 or 4 margins of errors. And that takes us our story into the election. that people are thinking up to Election Day, this is too close to call, but the Republicans are going to win. And the reason why I say this, and I start to catch some themes here, is that the Democrats did manage to hold on into the Senate. They held on in the Senate, and the polls were actually dead on score, saying that these races were too close to call at the state level, within the margins of errors, and it was all about what? Who was going to show up to vote. And what occurred at this point is that there were enough college-educated suburban women who showed up to vote who were more motivated by the reproductive rights issue. They weren't saying that the economy wasn't important, but they were more motivated by the reproductive rights issue than others who were motivated or not motivated by the economy issue. It was what? Barely small numbers that made the difference. For those of you who know about the state legislature in Minnesota, it was the same thing, if I can draw a parallel there. If we moved around a couple of thousand votes in the Minnesota Senate or the Minnesota House, the Republicans would control at least one or both houses of the legislature. It was what? The logic of the small number of swing voters moving up and showing up or not showing up. In 2020, rather, I take it back. In 2016, as I said to you, we thought going into 2016, it was going to be 10% of the voters in 10 states determine who gets the 270 electoral votes. I gave a paper in Chicago all about that. And when I finished, somebody said to me, "Hey, Schultz, you know what? It's not just about the states, it's about the counties. And don't you realize there are only a few counties and a few states that matter?" I wish I could remember the woman who came up and told me that. And I went out and I did the numbers and found that, guess what? In all the critical swing states, there's a county that matters. And in the general election, if you look at the swing states like Michigan or Arizona and so forth, the candidates know this. During the general election, not only do they only go to the swing states, but they go to the critical swing counties. And so I had to amend it to say that, guess what? Within each state, there's only a certain number of counties. And so eventually I amended it to say there's only what? About 10% of the voters located what? In 17 counties across 10 states that matter. I was thinking 200,000 voters would matter. The reality that turned out in 2016, only 3 states mattered. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Moved 93,000 voters in those 3 states. Secretary Clinton is President of the United States. 4 years later, in 2020, it turns out that there's only 3 states that also matter. Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. By that number, 43,000 voters. That's all that really mattered in that election. Move 43,000, Donald Trump's finishing his second term. A few years ago, I had a person in Lakeville, a junior at one of the Lakeville high schools, sends me an email and says, "I'm going to be applying to college this fall. I'm thinking of majoring in political science. I have no idea what political science is. Can I hang out with you at the summer and try to figure it out?" And I said, "Well, great. Hang out with me and we'll both figure it out in terms of it." And we looked at data. I'm almost to the point back then of being able to say within those swing counties, there are swing precincts that matter. Put it all together, I'm almost to the point of being able to say a few swing voters and a few swing precincts and a few swing counties and a few swing states that matter. Not quite down to saying how Fred and Ethel vote on Elm Street in a particular place matter, but they do. Point being is that my model for thinking about especially presidential elections focuses on how maybe economic variables, how maybe approval ratings come down to what? Moving an incredibly small number of voters in a few places across the country. So now you ask, Schultz, where does this all bring us here? All right. So last October, I did a piece, and I'm updating it today. And it's a piece in October that said, if the election were held today, the Democrats should be very worried. Now, you might recall there was a lot of news about a couple of months ago that the New York Times did a piece and talked all about the president being in danger. I wrote the person who wrote the article and said, nice article. I wrote the same piece 2 months earlier. I'm still waiting to hear back from him. I haven't yet. So let me give you some hard numbers here, and then I'm going to update them to today. Right off the bat, I will tell you that I think in this election, there are probably only 5 states that matter at this point. And within those 5 states, there's a county that's particularly important in each one. So my 5 states are, and I'll tell you the counties, Arizona, and it's Maricopa County. The second, it's going to be, for our purposes, it'll be Georgia. It will be in Georgia, it will be Fulton County. In Michigan, it will be probably Wayne County. In Pennsylvania, it'll be Allegheny County. And in Wisconsin, it will be Brown County. Those are the 5 states and the 5 counties that matter. It's going to come down to. New York Times also lists Nevada. Maybe yes, but I think Nevada falls in line, all the trends that I've been looking at, and will vote for Biden. Last October, when I calculated this, I said that given the fact that the other 45 states plus the District of Columbia are pretty certain, I added up all the numbers and I said, well, as of last October, and I still say the same thing today, by the way, same number, that Donald Trump right now probably has 235 electoral votes. Joe Biden has 232. You need to get to 270 to win the election. There are 5 states, those 5 states that I mattered, that have a total of 71 electoral votes. Okay. It's going to come down to the voters in those 5 states. My guess is the voters that will matter in those 5 states are in those 5 counties. It'll probably come down to those swing voters in those swing counties, in those swing states, maybe even down to those swing precincts. I'm going to guess somewhere in the neighborhood of between 100 to 150,000 voters will actually matter. Right? Last October, when I did the calculations, how it came out is that by the time I looked at the fact that at that point you had Biden leading in Michigan and Wisconsin, back then, last October, Trump was leading in Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. Add those up. Last October, Trump would have won the presidential election 281 electoral votes to Biden's 257. Now, a few months later, things have shifted a little bit. It now looks like that Biden has a lead in Michigan and in Pennsylvania. Trump has the other states. Some of them, like Wisconsin, are still within the margin of error. If the calculations are correct in terms they are right now, what the election would be today, if we're held today, based on the polling, is Trump 282 electoral votes, Joe Biden 264. Trump wins the election as of right now. But remember what I said to you. If polls or political science models were perfect predictors, especially this far out, I don't even know why we hold an election. Candidates matter, messages matter, themes matter. And this election is incredibly hard to predict for two or three reasons. One of them is we've never seen a situation where a former president is challenging a current president, and the former president faces 91 indictments across four criminal indictments, 4 criminal trials, and 91 indictments. Additionally, we have next week the U.S. Supreme Court is going to consider the insurrection clause case. We've got incredible numbers of variables out there that we just have never confronted so far in American politics. Additionally, I'm going to throw in a couple of other things that I should be done in about a minute here, is that we also have the fact that I don't know how to predict the variable of how an expanded war in Israel with the Hamas plays out. I don't know what's going to happen in terms of potentially, given what happened yesterday with, Biden vowing to retaliate, we could have a much more expansive war in the Middle East now than anybody thinks. So these become real complexities to think about down the line here. Now, I will say I do have a couple of sort of predictions about predictions at this point, if I can use that. One of them is the fact that we oftentimes like to talk about the October surprises. Those things that we just can't sort of see. Some people call them the black swans. In politics, we call them the October surprises. Trump has been trying to do a job about pushing the litigation, to push the criminal trials, beyond the election so that they're not an issue. There's only I'm a practicing lawyer. I've been before federal judges before. There's only so far in how hard you can push a federal judge. At some point, they push back. They've got tight dockets. They want to get things done. I think what winds up happening is that Trump manages to push some of the trials a little bit later, but those trials start to go where? Perhaps during the convention, perhaps in September. If I'm going to make a prediction for anything, the October surprise becomes a verdict in one of the criminal trials sometime in October. And we have evidence that among independent voters, including college-educated suburban women, that a conviction could make a big difference. Right now, some of them are sort of, do I show up, do I not show up, do I vote for Trump, do I not vote for Trump? We have evidence, and just in general, among independent voters, over a third of them are saying a conviction could have a significant impact on their decision not to vote for Trump. Okay. So now, as I bring it all together here, notice what I've talked about here. I've talked about a whole bunch of different things in terms of how to think about how to make predictions, how political science think about it. I've tried to give you a little bit of an insight into how I think about issues. But having said all of that, we've got these variables out there that are just really the imponderables. And I'm almost going to want to, maybe I will, I'll end with Donald Rumsfeld's great line. Donald Rumsfeld was criticized many years ago, but he was absolutely right when he said, we have known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And he was absolutely correct when he talked about that. The unknown unknowns are the things that keep us awake all at night or something like that. I think I'm in the realm of, I have known unknowns. And I think I can figure out what those are, but don't know what the results are going to be. But what I still don't know are the unknown unknowns that could emerge in the next few months. Okay, so let me stop there. All right, so thank you very much for letting me speak, and questions, comments, whatever. So who's got questions, comments? There's got to be some. Go ahead. Excellent. Third party. Okay, so now we get to throw in one more variable, which I should have talked about here. All right, if we look at the presidential election, and the American public, depending on what numbers we're looking at here, but about 60% of the American public is saying, we do not want a Biden-Trump rematch. On one level, if it was just Biden versus Trump, a bunch of people would stay home on Election Day. Yeah. However, RFK Jr. is one of several candidates who are out there. RFK Jr. being the most fascinating right now. I mean, he is a Kennedy, which means he has the money to stay in the race. He's got the resources to do it. And right now, he's being very effective about getting on the ballots across the country. He's polling at about 20% in the polls in the United States right now. Now, I don't know how much people really know about RFK Jr. He's not his father. That's simply the way of describing it for now. But at 20%, he can have a dramatic impact upon the race at this point. What's really interesting right now, if you start to look at the polling data, and again, I still want to say, by the way, the polling data at its point in time is accurate. Polls are not predictors, they're snapshots in time. If you look at the polling, RFK Jr. is taking more votes away from Donald Trump than he's taking away from Joe Biden. What he's doing at this point is splitting the anti-Biden vote. Because remember, an election like this with a president running for re-election, it's a referendum on the sitting president. And Trump is counting on the fact that there'll be enough anti-Biden sentiment along with the support for him that puts him across the finish line. RFK Jr. can move enough votes in a few number of swing states and a few number of swing counties that it could alter the election. That's why we're talking about the logic of small numbers. So I'm glad you raised that. I meant to put the RFK factor. Now, we could throw some other candidates in there too. Fundamental at the end of the day, if anybody's going to ask me about Dean Phillips is not going to go very far. RFK Jr. is really the person that I think is the biggest variable in the race. So we could see an impact similar to what Ross Perot had in 1992 in the Clinton-Bush race. Yeah. The question really is about, given the fact that I've been trying to talk a little bit about truth here, you're sort of curious about my thoughts on the fact that, and I'm kind of paraphrasing it here, that we have about the truth coming out of some candidates' statements or mouths, and the fact that, again, translating it from what you're saying here, we've got large portions of the American public that thought the election was stolen. I think sort of where you're going here. All right, so first off, in my alternative universe, among my colleagues who also teach election law and who are First Amendment scholars, I go in a very different direction. I actually think there's no constitutional right to lie. And I take a very different approach on this and think that we actually ought to take more seriously and hold candidates more seriously, both legally and politically, for the statements they say or they don't say, or the lies they make and so forth like that. But having said that, there is a certain amount of frustration that Donald Trump is appealing to. We've seen since the 1970s the gap between the rich and poor go to unprecedented levels in American history. We saw an incredible restructuring of our economy where at one point maybe some of you or maybe your parents could, with just a high school degree, go off and work at a union factory and make a pretty good paycheck and not worry about things. Those jobs disappeared. The gap between the rich and poor increased. And the Democratic Party, which basically became the party of the college-educated, more affluent, certainly wasn't as sympathetic to the working class as they were before. The Republican Party was not also perceived as being sympathetic. And a guy comes along named Donald Trump who knows how to talk on television. After 17 years or 16 years of The Apprentice, knew how to verbalize, knew how to be charismatic, and said, neither of the two parties, the establishment, really cares about you. I do. And the reason why you're facing problems is because of what? Of the immigrants. Or you're facing problems because of unfair trade wars with China. His message resonates with a bunch of people who what? I hate to say it, who've not been the economic winners in the last 30, 40 years. And he's been able to sort of speak to that anger and frustration. I'm also not going to deny the fact, and I'm trying to do this as nonpartisan as possible, because I am nonpartisan, there's certainly a racial component, there's no question, to a lot of what's being said here. But we should think about the economic roots of the frustration, the economic roots and anger that's out there that I think is driving a lot of what's happening right now. Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about our national budget and whether Mike Johnson will survive the March go-around?
Boy, we actually have two different issues. We got the budget and we have the raising of the national debt again. So we got two different things that are going on here. He survived for now, mostly because he's surviving because I actually think he's doing what you're supposed to be doing, which is forming a coalition with Democrats and Republicans. But he may very well pay the price again with his own party again in terms of it. But there's two opportunities to see if he's going to be able to survive on this one. I always want to hope that smarter minds will prevail and that in an election year, every time the government has shut down, the party responsible for the government shutdown has paid the price in the election. And right now, the public is blaming the Republicans on this one. You would think that somewhere along the line, the people who are writing the messaging and who are doing the focus groups for the Republicans would be saying, just keep the government going, folks. Don't shut it down. But I'm not sure about that. I just don't know. I just don't know. That's another one of the imponderables and how it plays out. Liz, go ahead. And over here.
David, I was wondering if you could talk about higher education in the context of the presidential race, but also congressional. And I just want to cite three quick examples.
Yeah.
Recently, we had the Ivy League professors before Congress that raised issues
Yeah.
about student protests. We had the Supreme Court ruling saying that race cannot be used in college admissions. And obviously at Hamlin, an episode you're very familiar with was the controversy surrounding
Yeah.
academic freedom
Right.
with the religion class. So it seems that higher ed has been elevated, and I'm wondering how you think that figures into 2024, either congressional races or presidential.
Sure. I'm going to add one more thing to it, too. I've probably, for the last 20 years, on the side, have also written about the rise of what I've called the corporate university. And I've also talked about how the business plan for higher education, if it hadn't already collapsed before 2008, it clearly crashed after 2008, and it's still teetering at this point. So I want to throw that in here and also talk about the fact that we're looking at $1.8 trillion in student loan debt, which exceeds by 2x the amount of credit card debt we have in the country. Higher education's business plan is crashed. It's crashed. We know that since 2008, roughly 2008, 2009, there are 1 million fewer students in college than there were before. Mostly, actually a little bit over 1 million. In 2026, we're going to get to what's called in higher education, what's called the demographic cliff. In 2008, when the recession kicked in, people cut back on having children. And what we're going to see in 2028, roughly 18 years later after that, 2026, 18 years after 2008, 2009, a dramatic drop in the number of 18-year-olds and 18-year-olds thinking of going to college, and 18-year-olds saying, oh gosh, why do I want to pay $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year, $100,000 a year to go to school and amass all this student debt? So the business plan is crashed. What happened at Hamlin, actually, I'm going to criticize my own school. I was on sabbatical last year. What my school did was completely blew it. Completely blew what happened there in terms of the response and what happened in the class there. And what happened before Congress was also an enormous mistake. It would not have, most of us in this room would have said, when asked the question, calling for genocide against Israelis, is it to violate the campus speech code? The answer is simple. Yes, it is. You can expel people for reasons like that. So there's a business plan problem, there's a cultural problem. And I think higher education is now dead center as one of several issues. Maybe not the most important issue, but again, if you're listening to what I'm saying here, politics is about marginalities. It's moving small numbers of people. And could this be one of those issues that becomes a major talking point that affects a small number of voters and moves it? I think yes. I'm also going to throw one more thing in here. I know I'm answering more of a question than Liz was asking here. Okay, let's do some numbers here. Bethel, Northwestern, Hamlin, Concordia, Augsburg, St. Kate's. In 4 years, how many of them think can survive? McAllister will survive. It's got an endowment of about $900 million. A long time ago, they got money from the Lila Wallace Foundation, i.e. Reader's Digest. They're in good shape. With numbers that we're looking at, some of you probably have seen stories. Minskew is down 40 to 50% in terms of enrollment. We've got St. Cloud, which I think is down almost 50%. MCTC is down like 45, 46%. Higher education in Minnesota, public and private, among most schools is hemorrhaging at this point. What happened on whatever that date was, I forgot the date was, with the 3 Ivy League schools, was that November or December, whatever it was? That was just sort of galvanized, I think, the problem with higher education and how much of higher education is really out of touch with, I think, sort of average America at this point.
Which is scary about college-educated women.
Yeah. Ooh. Oh, actually, I did a piece in, anybody saw it? If anybody saw it, I actually did a piece in MinPost about a month ago, and it was called When College Was Male. And my whole argument is to say that we also know in the last 15 to 20 years that college now is about 60 to 65% female. Is there any coincidence by the fact that that as universities are being attacked, it's at a time when they've shifted from being majority male to majority female? I don't think it's a coincidence, folks, at all. Additionally, if you actually start to look at this point, the fact that if you look at high school graduates who are male and female, or college graduates who are male and female, males are what? They're making 17 to 20 to 25% more than females at comparable education levels. The only way that women make up the differences between income between male and female, they got to be way better educated. Kick college when it's down, what do? You basically undermine a lot of the value and a lot of the advantages that, not advantages, a lot of the help that women have achieved in the last 30 to 40 years to overcome sexism in our society.
Thank you. No more questions.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
Stay up here, David.
I will.
Thank
I'm
you
not going
very
anywhere.
much.
Okay. All right.
And I'm sure you'll answer some more questions.
Of course.
Afterwards.
Okay.
But we're delighted to have you with us. We make donations in our speaker's honor with Roseville Woods and
Good.
the Arboretum here in Roseville. And we give our speakers a four-way test coin.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So we're delighted to have you with us.
You probably can't see that.